This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Anyone, any questions, guys, before I can get started? Anyone, any questions that I can take before we get started?
Sir, good morning, sir. Madhu here.
Good, Madhu.
Sir, I have one doubt on that self-hosted model, sir.
Okay.
Sir,
Good, please.
in Microsoft hosted, everything is done by Microsoft only. It's their headache only, and we're creating
Yes.
virtual machines on everything in the background. Then coming
Yes.
to self-host means we have to create and we have to manage everything, the build machines, right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
uh, later point we can also destroy the machine also, sir, right?
Yes, we can later point
That
destroy the machine
virtual.
also. Yes. Mhm.
So if we destroy that machine, that time whatever the configuration we made and that virtual machine also got destroyed for agent.
Yes. Yes.
So again we cannot use, sir. It's not able to. We cannot able to use that agent for the pipeline, right, sir? Again we
Yes.
have to
Correct.
create
We
it.
cannot use the. We have to create a new agent out there for the pipeline.
Again we have to create it.
Yes. Again, we have to create it. If you destroy the machine that is currently running, if you destroy that, we would need to again create a new. Sorry, we would need to again create a new machine.
Okay, okay, sir. That's my. Thank you, sir. Sir, one more
Okay.
doubt, sir. I have.
Mhm.
Sir, in
Good, please.
yesterday's session, you have seen how to release the code in the stages, right, sir?
Correct.
That means in the development stage, QA stage. Say
Correct.
coming to development stage, there is if it is if you enable that automatic, sorry, continuous deployment trigger,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so automatically code got released.
Correct. Into
So
development, yes.
in between these stages also in mid development and
Mhm.
testing also, this what is it? This
Continuous
automatic trigger
deployment.
got
Mhm. Yes, correct, please.
here also continuous trigger also enabled here, na, sir. So is there any
Yes.
time frame or automatically got triggered?
It will automatically get triggered. So I have the after stage. So if you just click on this one, so here if I just click on this on development, it is telling it is after release, which means that as and when a new artifact is available here, as and when meaning a new build pipeline is triggered, it will directly go ahead and deploy it to development environment. That's what after release really means out here. So if I click here on pre-deployment conditions, this is what it's telling me. It's telling me, okay, fine, you know what, after release, as soon as the release is done, please go ahead and take this code inside the environment into development. When you come into QA, if I click on this one, it's telling after stage. It's telling please continuously deploy it into QA after the stage called development. If I say manual only, this will now become a manual trigger, which means it's telling, okay, fine, after as and when the release is created, I'll deploy it to development, but you have to manually deploy it to QA. If you click on this condition, and there is one more thing called after release. This is how it looks like. So you can order or you can arrange your pipeline accordingly. So now it's telling, okay, fine, you know what? I'll deploy it to development and parallelly I'll deploy it to QA. This is a parallel deployment. This is how we can arrange things out here. Such. Does that answer your question? Okay, for now I'll just put it after stage and I'll put this as development stage, which means that whenever a release is created, it will directly go ahead and deploy it into development, and after development, it will move into QA automatically. There will not be any time delay out here as such. Yes, anyone, any questions here?
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Sir,
Hmm.
about the users, we'll be
Okay,
adding users in the DevOps portal, no, sir? The
correct.
same users we have to add in Azure portal also.
If the user needs the access onto the Azure portal, then yes. Meaning, in my case, I need an access onto DevOps. I also need an access onto Azure portal also. In this case, yes, I will be adding my ID both to, let's say, the Azure portal and also the DevOps portal out here as such. Or if you have an Active Directory integration with Azure DevOps, You don't really need to add sorry, you don't really need to add your users explicitly into Azure DevOps. Whichever user you added into your Azure Active Directory will automatically get synced into Azure DevOps out here as such. So you can also maintain an automatic sync between Azure portal and Azure DevOps out here as such. Yes,
Sir,
any more questions?
that sir, one small thing. So that means automatically when you establish a connection between DevOps and Azure, automatically
Mhm.
whatever the users you added in the Azure portal automatically come into DevOps, right, sir?
No, it's not the service connection that I'm talking about. So if you go into
Mm.
the organization settings, there is something called Azure Active Directory integration. So you'll have to connect with your Azure Active Directory. So this is how the connection between your AD users and the DevOps users will sync. That's what it's telling you. See, connect your organization to Azure Active Directory. This action maps existing Azure DevOps users in their organization to the corresponding identities in the Azure AD out here as such. Service connection will just establish, or service connection will just give DevOps an access to go ahead and, let's say, create something on your Azure portal or delete something on your Azure portal or deploy the code onto your Azure portal and so on and so forth. Yes, any
Thank
more questions, please? Mhm. Okay, so let's look at today's topic. Let's come here and let's edit this release. So if you look at this release, it just has two different tasks. Priyanka, do you have a question? I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. Just has two different tasks out here. One, it's telling it is create the infrastructure. So what we did is that we yesterday we had an ARM template. We made sure that we have an ARM template out here, and we have the code here, and we just created a build pipeline, or we just modified our build pipeline so that the ARM templates are just copied into, let's say, the build.artifact staging directory, nothing but the drop location. And I am coming here into my release pipeline, and I'm starting to use these ARM templates out here in my release by adding one simple task called create infrastructure, or this task name goes by something called ARM template deployment. I've changed the name according to, let's say, my own convenience, and I said that this is a create infrastructure task. Sorry, if I just scroll down, it's telling the scope of the deployment is resource group. Connection is the service connection that we established. It's asking which subscription out here, and then it's telling, okay, fine. What do you want to really do out here? Do you want to, let's say, create or update a resource group? I'll say yes. I want to create the update a resource group with the name called devrg, the location, and then I'm telling what is, let's say, my template, and then I'm clicking here and I'm declaring the values that are required by my template, because these are the values that I did not really declare in my template anywhere. So I am passing them as a template override. We call them as template overrides so that it can be deployed. And I am trying to create this particular app service with the name called dev app service 000 xyz. And then in the app service deployment, which is the next task, again I'm using the same service connection. I'm using all these things out. I'm using all these things out here. And finally, I'm telling, okay, fine, this is dev app service 000 xyz. So what's happening, if you see, guys, is that this name, right, dev app service xyz 000, this is getting repeated in two different tasks, task 1 and task 2. So whenever I change this name to, let's say, this is not 000, let's say this is 001, I'll also have to go into the second task and I have to say that this is 001. It's something that I have to do. Now, these are just two tasks, and I'm just looking at one variable, or I'm just looking at, let's say, one name that I'm changing. Imagine when you're working in a real-time environment, there are about 20 different tasks out here. So what happens is that whenever you change the name here, you have to go into your second task, change that, third task, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, so on and so forth, and change all the values in each and every task out here. Again, it's just one value that I'm changing. What if I also change the name of my plan? And imagine that the plan name is also being used in every task. You again have to go into all the tasks and change that too. In the same way, I also have to update the QA stage. So every time I create something here, let's say a different task here, I'll have to, let's say, make sure that I create the same task here as well, and also make sure that I update the names here. Let's say I want this to be 001, this also to be 001 out here, which means, see, though my pipelines are automated, I still have a lot of manual portions in my pipeline to address. What are the manual portions? Is all these values that I've hard coded on my pipeline. All what I did is that I hard coded all these things out here. So there's a lot of hard coding that is happening in my pipeline, which is not good because I would like to have my pipelines reusable. Meaning, if tomorrow I want to, let's say, go ahead and let's say create another stage. So I'll just clone this and I'll call this as a staging environment. I shouldn't really do anything. I shouldn't come here. I again shouldn't update all these things to, let's say, stage hyphen RG. Here again, I don't want to come here and then say stage something like this, which makes it very manual. If there are multiple tasks here, I have to go into each and every task and then update the same thing out here, which is not ideal. So firstly, let me delete this out. So to delete it, I'll just click here. Okay, I'll just click here on the stage name. Say delete the stage. Say okay. So let's begin with dev and QA, and then make sure that our pipelines are, or make sure that the stages in our pipelines are absolutely reusable. The reusability is something that I want to now introduce by using Azure DevOps variables. So we did look at variables in a very brief way when we were doing, let's say, something like build pipelines. Here in release pipelines, variables play a very crucial role, which we'll see and how they basically adjust themselves in this particular scenario, and how can they help you out here as such. So what I'll do, let me first delete this stage also. I'll say delete. I'll come down to variables, and there are three things that I'm looking at. I'll say add. I'll say rg name. Say add. I'll say app service name. I'll say add. I'll say app service plan name. So three different things that I'm actually looking at, because these are the three different things that I have, let's say, in my stages of the pipeline, the steps of my pipeline that are being consumed. I'll just scroll towards the right, and there is something called as a scope of this particular variable. What do you mean by a scope of the variable? Is that let's see, if I click on this particular button here, the scope says its release and its development, and currently the scope of this particular variable is set to release, which means that this variable called rg name, let's say with a value called dev, can be called and can be used in not only this stage, but if I have a different stage, I can also call this value. I can also call this, let's say, key value pair. I can say rg name is equal to dev. If I have another stage called staging, here also that I can be using this particular variable because the scope is set to release, which means all the stages in your release pipeline can use this particular variable with this particular value called dev. But this is something, sorry, this is something that I don't want to happen. Why I don't want to happen is because the RG name called dev RG should be only valid for a stage called development. So what I'll do, I'll come here, I'll change the scope of this particular variable to development. So I'm saying only development should have this value called dev hyphen RG. I'll just scroll down. App service name also is something that I'll scope to development, and I'll say that this is dev app service XYZ UC000 USC to something like this. I'll scope it to only development, telling that you know what, development should use this particular value. App service plan name also I'll scope it to only development, and I'll say it is dev plan 01. This is what I'm doing. Now, I've just declared the variables. I've just declared all these variables out here. So I'll just copy all of them. I've just declared them. Now, in my tasks, I'll use them. How will I use them? Is I'll remove this value. I'll remove the hard coding. And in order to call a variable in Azure DevOps, I'll say dollar open and close parenthesis. Between that, the name of the variable. For example, RG name. So I'm saying dollar open and close parenthesis, the RG name out here. I'm calling that particular variable. And even your location can also be variableized, shouldn't be a problem. Then app service plan name. In place of dev plan 01, I'll take this out. A dollar open and close parenthesis again, and whatever was the name of the plan that I declared. It's called app service plan name. That's what I declared there. And finally, in the place of the web app name, I'll take this out and I'll again say dollar open and close parenthesis and the name of the variable that I declared, which is app service name, and I'll say okay. So what I'm doing, I'm not hard coding at all. I'm just making sure that I declare every variable and I'm using that variables. Again, going back into app service deployment also, I won't hard code here. Say dollar open and close parenthesis and then the app service name out here. So I'm calling all my variables. So I declared my variables on something called as pipeline variables out here. Now I'm calling all my variables. What this does is that it makes sure that the stage is reusable, which means that if I just clone this out and if I call this as QA, now what Azure DevOps does is that if you go into your variable section, it will go ahead and add three more variables out here. So these three variables are for development, which is dev and something. It now understands that okay, okay, fine, you also have one more stage, just called QA, which also needs all these three variables. And Azure DevOps tells, okay, fine, you know what? I'll adjust the scope for you. So three are for development, three are for QA, and what you can now do is just change these values here and say here it is QA plan. What this now does is that this now gives you a freedom not to go into each and every individual task and change the values out here, because this makes it much more difficult. This is actually easier. I can just go ahead declare all these values and my job is done. I can change the values, my job is done. Now if I want another environment, I'll say stage. Azure DevOps automatically declares three more variables for stage, scopes them into stage. Now I can say this is stage RG. I can say this is STG something like this, stage something like this. I can say this is a stage plan 01 and have this in this way. So now I can save this out and now I can create my release pipelines. And now it's telling, okay, fine, I'll deploy firstly to development, then to QA, then to staging. If you want to manually deploy to QA and staging and only development should be continuous integration, you can just click on this one. You can just click on these things. It'll turn into, let's say, ash color or gray color, and development is in blue, which tells that it's a continuous deployment. I'll say create. Now release 7 has, has been created. And if you see, it's continuously deploying to, let's say, development and manual deployment to QA. And now I'm making use of all my variables out here as such. I'm making use of all my variables that are scoped to specific environments. The scope here is properly set to development, to QA, to staging, and so on and so forth. Now if I go, now if I go inside, And now I check this out. And now when you are inside the stage called development, when you click on the variables, you'll only see those three variables that are scoped to development. You'll only see those three variables that are now scoped to, let's say, an environment called development out here as such. Now if you check this out, it's telling create the infrastructure, and it's telling okay fine, you know what, I will try to create the infrastructure and so on and so forth. And it's now getting all the values. So what Azure DevOps would firstly do is that during the initialized job phase, when it's trying to, let's say, startup, when it's trying to, let's say, go ahead and do a startup out here, it'll first download all the, or it'll first call the agent, and it will also try to understand what are all the variables that are there, that is, let's say, scope to the environment. Now all these are predefined variables. Everything that you see here are predefined, but there are a couple of variables that are user defined. For example, the app service name, which is telling it is dev app service xuz000 something like this. And then you have the app service plan name, which is dev plan 01. And then you have the RG name also. If you just scroll down, you'll have the resource group name also, which is telling it is dev hyphen RG out here as such. And it's creating the infrastructure, it's doing the app service deployment, and it's taking these values. Now, if I go ahead and trigger a release for QA, the values are going to be different. So if I go even into QA and look at the variables, do you see now it's only showing me the variables that are scoped to QA? If I go to staging, say logs and say variables, it will only show me the variables that are scoped to the staging environment out here as such. What this now does is that it now gives you great flexibility. You don't have to go into each and every task of your pipeline, change the value, go into a different stage, change the values. Don't do that. You can just go and declare all the variables out here, scope them to the corresponding environments, and your job is done. This is how you can make sure that the pipelines are reusable out here as such. Yes, any questions here, guys, on what are variables and so on and so forth? Anyone, any questions? Guys, any questions? Are we good here?
No, sir. Very good.
Okay.
Good, sir.
Okay, so let's do one thing. Let's make our pipelines a little bit more reusable. What do I mean by that is this. Let's go to our variables. See, what is happening right now is that whenever I'm creating a new stage, there are three set of variables that are getting added, called app service name, app service plan name, RG name. They're telling, okay, fine, three set of variables added for a different stage. For example, if I go ahead and click on this particular pipeline, clone this particular stage, and I'll say production. And when I say production, as in when I do this, automatically there are again three set of variables that are added for an environment called production. And Azure DevOps is just expecting me to change these values to whatever values that I need. Good enough, but sometimes what happens is that firstly let me delete the stage. Good enough, but sometimes what really happens here is that, see, as of now I'm just declaring three variables out here. So there are three stages. It's 3 into 3, 9 variables. Let's imagine that each and every stage has about 20 to 30 variables each. Is it possible? Definitely yes. When you are really working, when you're going into a real-time environment, there's something that you will face a challenge with. And whenever you clone, instead of doing, let's say, three variables for each stage, you're doing 30 variables for each stage, which means 30 into 3, 90 variables is what you're managing. Imagine the amount of stages increase. Let's say you can have something like a dev, a QA, a staging, a pre-production testing, and then a production. You're looking at about 120 to 150 variables that you're managing out here, which again makes it more difficult, which again makes it a little complicated to adjust all these variables out here. So what I want to do is I want to make sure to declare generic variables that can be used across my environments, that can be used across everything out here, which means this is what I'll do. Firstly, let me delete the variables that I don't need. So I'll delete, let's say, all the other variables out here. So I'm again coming back with just 3 variables and which are scoped to the development environment. Let's see. In these variables, right, the only thing that is changing is dev, dev, and dev. In QA, it will be QA, QA, and QA. In staging, it will be stage, staging, and staging. STG, STG, STG. For production, it will be prod, prod, prod. And the remaining name is remain, or the rest of the name, the other part of the name is remaining the same, hyphen RG and so on and so forth. What I'll now do is I'll introduce one more variable called environment, probably say environment, and I'll say the environment is dev for an environment called development. The environment, same value again. Environment is QA for QA, again the same value, the same key, different value, different stage. I'll say STG stage for something called as stage. I'm changing the scope. These are the only three variables that I'm now using. And what I'll now do is instead of saying this is dev, I can call a variable inside a variable, meaning you can say it is dollar environment. I can do this. So I'll just copy this environment value. I can say dollar environment plus whatever is the name of your app service. I can change this to dollar environment plan 01. I can change this to dollar environment hyphen RG. What this does and what I'll do very importantly is now these are generic variables. These are generic values that depend upon a specific value called environment. So what I'll now do is I want to go ahead and scope this to the environment because this needs to be used across my pipeline. That's the idea. I'll change the scope to release. I'll make sure that I don't change the scope of this particular values because it is specific to environment, dev to dev, QA to QA, stage to stage. So I'll maintain them the way it is. Now tomorrow, if you would like to go ahead and add a stage called, sorry, you'd like to go ahead and add a stage called production, I'll say prod. And here, all I need to add is one more variable. That's it. Not so many. Just one more variable. I'll say PRD prod, scope to prod. The rest of the things remains the same. So now if I save this out, and now if I create a release, so I'm now creating a release to develop in QA, staging, and all these things out. And since the release is already deployed in the first time, what I'll do is I'll just create an empty release. I'm not deploying anything. I'm not doing anything. Just creating an empty release. I'll do the same thing for QA also to just demonstrate how the variables are coming into picture. I'll just say save. I'll say empty release. I'll say create the release out here. This is to just make sure that we are sticking to the time interval. You can create a full release out here. Just wanted to do a demo for just the variables out here. So I'll say development in QA. I'll say create. Now release 8 has been created. Now let's check this out. Now it's going into the development environment. And if you look at the variables out here right now, it has all these 3 variables which are scoped to something called release. When I say it is scoped to release, all the 4 environments that you have, development, QA, staging, and production, all these 4 can be using these values. But now you have one value specific to an environment called development because the scope of this particular value is only to something called development. Now what Azure DevOps does is that let's check the initialize job. This is the first step. It's an empty release, so it'll just go ahead and do initialize job out here. We'll just go there and we'll just see this. I'll just say Control F, and I look for something called okay, and I look for something called environment. And here the environment is called dev because the variable that you declared called environment is dev scoped to this particular environment called development. Good enough. I'll just come back. Now there are a couple of generic variables that I declared: app service name, plan name, RG name, which are sorry, which are internally dependent upon that particular value called environment. So if I go here and I'll say RG name. Now if you see RG name, Azure DevOps is telling okay fine dollar environment and then RG. Okay fine. So let me go ahead. So Azure DevOps is telling okay fine. Let me go ahead and change that environment to dev because that's the value of the environment. So I'll do a dev hyphen RG. Say okay great. This is what I can do. Then the app service name. If you see this, it's telling it is dev app service. The plan name is telling it is dev plan. So it's dependent upon one value called dev. Now if you go down to QA, which would have already triggered by now, if you go into the variables that are declared for QA, now see all these variables are common for both, all three variables are common for both, let's say dev and QA. One variable called environment that is changing. If this is changing, the other three variables that are dependent upon these are also changing. So now if I go into my logs, say initialize job, and look for something called environment QA. Now if I say RG name is QA RG. Now if I say app service name, it is QA app service and then QA plan 01 out here as such. This is how I can now have a great control on my entire release, telling that okay fine, you know what, I can just go ahead clone one more stage. All I need to do is just go ahead and add one more variable called environment. That's it. I don't need to, let's say, go ahead add so many things out here, which will become a headache as and when your release grows. So it's better to plan, or it's better to, let's say, plan defining your variables right at the first stage out here as such, which will help you have a good control on your release without doing a lot of manual work out here as such. Yes, any questions here, guys? Anyone, any questions that I can take clear?
Sir, but we didn't give any numerical, no, sir. You said like bulk. Yeah,
Hmm.
for example, if you want to create 5 to 6, then
So when you say 5 to 6, I didn't get you. Can you come again, please?
no, this you are showing is for bulk, no, sir, bulk creation.
Hmm. Hmm.
But we didn't add any numerical, no, sir. Like, for
Okay.
example, if you want to create 5 or 6,
Okay. When you say when you want to create 5 or 6, what are those 5 or 6 again? Are they resource groups or are they app services? What exactly that you mean by that?
both, both, sir.
Both app services and something.
Yes,
Then you
because
can declare. Mhm.
in the real time, we'll be having bulk creation only, no, sir.
That's fine. For which you can give a comma separated value here. You can say something like environment non-02. You can do this. You can go ahead and, let's say, give an array out here or an array of values that you can declare, which will help you doing a bulk creation out here as such. So that shouldn't be a problem. You can have multiple things that are declared, and those multiple things can be parallelly. I mean, you can go ahead and create all these things parallelly out here as such. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yes. Any more questions, guys? Any more questions? And anyone who's not following this, please let me know because this is one of the most important concepts that you come across, and one of the most important concepts that are asked you in an interview about variables, and then something called variable groups, which I'll talk about. But in the variables, Any questions that I can take? Okay.
No, sir.
God please. Okay. So moving forward, let's see. See, these are all called as pipeline variables or local variables. Why do I call them as pipeline variables? Why local variables? Is because let's say that in a scenario that you are creating a new release pipeline. Your client is telling, okay, fine, you have a .NET application. I also have a different application called .NET application 2, probably something like this. And your client is now telling that, you know what, in the variables, I want the same set of variables that you declared here. Whatever you declared in the first release pipeline, I now want to, let's say, go ahead and use the same variables out here in the second release pipeline also. Probably these are just common variables for all your project. These are just all these variables that you declared are common for all your project out here. So now what you do is you come here and you say, okay, fine, the client has asked me, I'll just copy everything, paste it here, give a value. So copy the second one, paste it here, give a value. Copy the third one, paste it here, give a value. Copy fourth one, paste it here, give a value. Again, quite human in nature, or quite, let's say, time taking process. We have multiple variables out here. The local variables that you declare, all the pipeline variables that you declare, can be only used by the pipeline in which they are declared. They cannot be used across your project. Meaning, if I have a pipeline 2 or a pipeline 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, they cannot be using these particular variables, which means that if you declare them in the pipeline variable out here, if you go ahead and declare a value in the pipeline variable, they are sorry, they have a restriction that you can only be using them in this particular pipeline only. You cannot reuse them in a different pipeline, and that's where variable groups comes into your help. Variable groups are used for all those values which are common to your project, which you need to use across your pipelines. You have hundreds of pipelines. All those pipelines want to consume these variables out here, for which you can be using sorry, you can be using something known as a variable group. Variable groups are also called as libraries in Azure DevOps, or you can normally call this as global variables throughout your project. So you can call them as library, you can call them as global variables, or you can call them as variable groups. And things okay. And in order to create a variable group or a library, in the left hand side of my screen, I have something called library. I click on this, open this in a new tab, and here there are no variable groups or no libraries. I'll just say add, and I'll add a library called development. Again, three things out here, or four things out here. I'll say environment or env in generic. It is dev, and I'll say go ahead and say app service plan name or no whatever that I declared here. So I have we have a couple of things called app service name, the app service plan name. I'll say app service name. I'll say app service plan name, and I'll say RG name. Here, same thing. I'll say dollar env. Sorry, dollar open close parenthesis env, followed by whatever is the name of my application that I declared. So to make sure that I maintain a consistency, I'm using the same names out here. And I'll say dollar env, say plan 01, say dollar env, say hyphen rg. So this can be env or environment, whatever it is that you have declared. I'm good with that. So I'll just declare the same thing what is there so that it'll avoid the confusion. this out and let me paste it here. So I'm changing this out. I'll say save. Now I have a library for development. So if you click on libraries, you have something for development. I need for QA, I need for staging, I need for production in the future. Instead of again redoing all these things, I can just hit the clone button here. I'll say clone. I can change this to QA. I'll just scroll down. I'll say this is QA. I'll say save. I'll clone once again. I'll say STG stage. I'll say this is STG stage. That's it. Save out here. I'll do a clone again. I'll say prod. If I scroll down, all I need to change is this one called prod. I'll save this out. Now if I go into my libraries, I have now 4 different libraries out here that I have created just now, ready to be used across my pipeline in the same project. Which means that if I want to change my pipelines to from variable groups to variables, I'll go into variable groups. I'll say link variable groups, and I can say okay, fine, a link development to a stage called development, and I'll say link, let's say prod, to a stage called prod. I can say link QA. Again, this has to be done once at a time. So I'll say link development to development. Let's say link. It's a link variable group link prod to prod. I'll say link. I'll say link QA to a stage called QA and link this out. I'll say link stage to stage. I can save this out. So instead of using my pipeline variables, I'm now using my variable groups. Now my client is asking, okay, fine, you know what, in new pipeline, can you use it? I'll just say very simple. Okay, fine. Let me go here into variable groups. Let me call this variable group, link it out. That's it. So this acts like a unit that you declare, which can be, let's say, carry forwarded inside your entire project. You can use it in your build pipeline also. So even if in your build pipeline, if I go here, maybe I don't want to use the variables. I can say variables. I can say variable groups. I can link the variable group. I can link these out. I can link these values so that even my pipelines or even let's say my build pipelines can be using this across the project out here as such. So variable groups are a concept that is used throughout the project. Pipeline variables is something which is only unique to one particular pipeline. You cannot use it into a different pipeline. You cannot carry it forward into a different pipeline out here as such. So that's the reusability advantage what a variable group gives you over a pipeline variable out here as such. Yes, any questions, guys? Anyone, any questions we can take till here? Anyone, any questions that I can take till here? Okay, so let me do one thing. Okay, let's say this .NET release application. This is okay, fine. Build application file. I don't need this. I'll say leave this out. I'll leave here also. I'll just come here, and this is what I want to do. Let me open the variables in one of the tabs, and let me go into the development stage. Now, what I'll do is I have a variable that is declared for an environment called development with a value called dev. I'll change this out to test. I'll say test here. I'll save this. Now, this is the challenge that I have, and this is what I would like to understand. I have a value called test that is declared in a variable group for a key called environment. Now I have the same value called environment to be dev, which is scoped to, let's say, development, and which is declared at a pipeline variable. So both have the same key called environment. This is what I have right now. Same pipeline, but I have a value, I have a key value pair called environment called dev, which is scoped to or which is declared at the pipeline variable, and then I have a value called environment called a test declared at the variable group and being used by the pipeline. Now my question is that if I create a release, what will be the value that Azure DevOps will pick up for that particular release? Will it be dev or is it going to be test? Anyone? Any guesses that you can take here?
I think test.
Okay, you think test. Okay. Anyone else?
Same test.
Test. Okay, let's try that out. Let's see what will happen here. As I create a release, again empty release out here, just to an environment called development. It's just sorry, it's just an empty release. It won't deploy anything out here as such. So let's say waiting to running for jobs, not expecting this out. Let's wait for let's say this particular thing to move away. Yes, now the agent is ready. It's telling agent is ready. All I want to look at is the first step, which is initialize job, which will just go ahead and tell me what are all the variables out here. So this is the confusion that I have. I have environment. One has dev, the other has test, but one is declared at the pipeline level, one is declared at the variable group level. So let's check out what will happen here. So environment, and what is the value that I'm getting is it is dev, which means Azure DevOps is taking this particular value and not this value out here. Getting my point? Now the value is coming as what? Dev here. It's not coming as test. But if I edit the pipeline once again, I'll just change the scope of this particular value. I'll say environment. This is dev, same value. I'm not changing the value. I'll change the scope from development to release. I'll say save. Then I'll create my release once again into development, and I'll now see what really happens. Now, do you think the nature of Azure DevOps will change? I have environment called dev declared at pipeline. Same thing, I have environment called test declared at variable group, but here value is scoped at release. Earlier, earlier value was scoped at an environment. Now take a guess. What do you think will be the value? Will it be dev or will it be test? What is Azure DevOps now going to consider? Anyone, if you want to take a
Test,
guess.
Test.
test,
Test.
it will be test.
Let's check that out. This is scenario 2. So let's see this. Let's say environment. Yes, it is test. So in scenario 1, let's put it as scenario 1, scenario 2, and so on and so forth. The value was declared at an environment level. In scenario 2, value is being declared at a release level. In scenario 1, variable group is scoped to a particular environment called dev. Scenario 2 also is happening the same thing. I did not change the scope of my variable group. It's the same. In scenario 3, in scenario 3, let me do this. Let me change the scope of my environment variable to release. That is declared in variable group. So again, I'll do one thing. I'll come here, say edit. I'll say edit release. Sorry, edit pipeline. I'll go to variable groups. I'll say variable groups. Here, I'll say more actions, change scope. Instead of putting it at a stage, I'll put it at a release. Now, same value, environment test. Environment is equal to test declared in the variable group that is scoped to release. Same value, environment development used in the pipeline variables scoped to release. This is my third scenario, and let me try going ahead and creating a release out here as such. Now let's see what is going to happen. Now guys, tell me in scenario 3, what will now be the value? Will it change to dev or will it stay at test? What do you think will be the value right now?
Dev.
Dev, which means that it's coming from release.
It will
Anyone
be
anyone who says it's test? Anyone who thinks it is test here? Test here. So let's take
a dev.
environment.
I think
Let's see.
test.
Yes. So I have test. I have dev. It is dev. Where is value coming from? Pipeline variable and not the variable group. But in scenario 2, it took test and not dev. This is called Azure DevOps order of precedence. What that means is this. When Azure DevOps tries to understand what is the key value pair, always the first priority will go to pipeline variables scoped to a particular environment or scoped to a particular stage, I can say. That's the reason in the first scenario, it said, okay, fine, dev. This value is scoped at a particular environment called development. That's the reason the value here came out to be environment is equal to dev in the first time. Second, what happened? The second priority will always and always go to variable groups scoped to a stage. That's the reason in scenario 2, you have something called environment is equal to dev, but the value was scoped to release. But environment test that is there in variable group was scoped to a particular stage called development. So it said, okay, fine, you know what? This is the value that I'll pick up. The third priority will always be given to pipeline variables scoped to release. That's the reason in scenario 3, what did we do is that we changed the scope of my variable group and then it automatically said, okay, fine, you know what? I see this value that is in release, which is pipeline. I'll take the value called dev. Fourth priority or the last priority will be given to variable groups or values in the variable groups scoped to release or scoped to release out here such. This is what will happen. So it's always stage and stage. Firstly, it will check for pipeline variables. Secondly, it will check for variable groups. Third, it will say, okay, fine, if you do not have either a pipeline variable scope to stage or variable group scope to stage, let me take up the release scenario. Let's see what are all the variables that are there in the release. And if a value or if both the values exist in the pipeline variable and the variable group scope to the same release, Azure DevOps will always and always pick up the variable groups out here. That's the reason in 3 different scenarios, we were able to get 3 different values by changing the order of scope. That is very important. This is called as Azure DevOps order of precedence of a variable out here as such. Yes, any questions, guys? Any questions here with this one? Again, it might seem confusing, but once you practice it, only then you'll be able to understand why the value is coming up like that and what can you do in order to, let's say, override that particular value and so on and so forth. So that's your assignment, is that take this, make sure that whenever you are practicing Azure DevOps, use as many as variables possible. because in the real-time environment you will be using variables only, variables, variable groups, and all these things, a combination of all these things out here. So use as many as variables possible. Let me know by changing the order, by changing, let's say, the way the variables are declared. Let me know how they behave, how they react to, let's say, your pipelines out here as such. And any questions that you can take before we close the session? Anyone, any questions?
Hi, good morning. Good morning, Abhishek.
Good, please. Good morning.
First, we need to understand why we are changing these stages, like variables,
Why you are changing the variable? When you say
from
changing the
base to
variable,
base to ASP.
why you are changing that? If I don't change that, then how will I be able to demonstrate what I want to, let's say, tell? Do you get the point? If I want to tell you that, okay, fine, this is the value that is coming in and this is the variable that is coming in, how will I even prove my point if I don't change the values?
No, sorry, not getting.
Sir, please go through the lecture once again. Uh, this is about variables and variable groups. So if I don't change it, I won't be able to even give you a demonstration on what is the value that is coming through. So please go through it. We anyways have a connect on Saturday, right? We will connect and we will address the questions that you do have.
Okay, sure.
Any more questions, guys? Okay, so please try this out. Let me know if you have any questions and I'll be happy to address them. Thanks, guys, and have a good day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.